committed to increasing and amplifying African and African diaspora perspectives and scholarship in both the GW Elliott School of International Affairs and the field of international relations overall through mentorship, professional and academic development, and community. Thank you everyone for attending our event today on race, gender, and international affairs, preparing students for future careers. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, each of which can wave once acknowledged: the Elliott School Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the International Affairs Society, GW Young Black Professionals in International Affairs, the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs, and the Leadership Ethics and Practice Initiative for their collaboration today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This session will be recorded, and we ask that you please keep all microphones off for the duration of the event. Questions from the audience can be shared in the chat, and we will have a panelist Q&A at the end of the discussion. Our discussion today is a continuation of an event spearheaded by the International Affairs Society on race and international affairs this past fall. Not only, the purpose of this event is to discuss how we can prepare future leaders and IA practitioners to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in their future careers. Thus, we've invited expert panelists today to speak to both their own individual experiences in scholarship, as well as solutions that they have supported in their respective roles in order to navigate and identify the intersections of race and gender in the field of international affairs, with a goal to better prepare the next generation of global leaders. Today's event is moderated by Dr. Marcus Du Bois King, who is currently a John O. Rankin Associate Professor and Director of the Master of Arts in International Affairs Program, MAIA, at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Boasting nearly 300 students, MAIA is the largest and most diverse graduate degree program of its kind. Dr. King draws on experience in public service, research, and the private sector. An expert on climate change, Dr. King has held presidential appointments at the Departments of Defense and Energy. He's a vice chairman of the Council on Strategic Risk and a senior fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Thus, without further ado, it is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. King and turn the floor over to him.
Thank you so much, Hannah. While we recognize we are calling in today from different locations, we still gather here as part of the GW and the Elliott School community. So a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the land that our institution rests upon, and also the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territory. Therefore, we recognize our institution resides on the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway and Anacostan people who have served as stewards for this region for generations. So quickly, I would like to take a brief moment to address events that unfolded here this week that are all on our minds, frankly. The actions of a mob that espouses ideologies of white power amplified a racist narrative of US history. So it's more important than ever to provide students with tools to counter this narrative. So as I said, this panel comes at the conclusion of this truly momentous week, which among other things, saw the conclusion of the Elliott School's orientation for new students. So as we welcome these students into our community, we're focused on how to prepare them to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion while at the Elliott School and in their future careers. So as members of the Elliott School community, we understand the disciplinary connections between race and gender in our research, teaching, and practice of international affairs. Our expert panelists, most of whom are educators, will then draw on their experiences in their respective fields to foreground race and gender issues and highlight steps to better prepare students to be leaders in this space. So therefore, it's my honor to introduce our panelists. First is Ambassador Prudence Bushnell. She has an impressive career history in the world of international affairs. She was nominated to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department Africa Bureau during the Clinton administration. She also served as ambassador to Kenya and subsequently Guatemala, and more recently as Dean of the Leadership and Management School at the Foreign Service Institute. Ambassador Bushnell was instrumental in attempts to stop the Rwandan genocide and is an expert in the role of women in conflict and post-conflict settings. Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins is founder and executive director of Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. Ambassador Jenkins has taught at an array of institutions, including the Elliott School. With an extensive background in government service, Ambassador Jenkins is an expert in the areas of arms control, disarmament, and nonproliferation. She was nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed as the US Senate as Special Envoy and Coordinator for Threat Reduction Programs in the Department of State. She holds several degrees, including a JD from Albany Law School and a PhD from University of Virginia. Dr. Shirley Graham is Director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs and Associate Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School. She teaches courses on global women, policy and gender, war and peace, and women in global politics. Dr. Graham's research includes the role of US military gender advisors, gender and peacekeeping, women in peacekeeping, and women's storytelling in peace and security. As a practitioner, she's an executive committee member of the US Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, a coalition of experts serving to inform and educate the US Congress, the administration, and civil society. She now leads the creation of a student consortium in the DC area to promote student research and leadership on the women, peace, and security agenda. Dr. Lakeisha Harrison is a professorial lecturer at the Elliott School. She's a scholar, attorney, and policy advisor. Her core area of teaching and research is the African continent. She researches the intersection of law, public policy, and religion through the lens of reproductive rights. Additionally, she's worked in the field of energy since 2003, and she provided expertise on a special project at the Department of the Interior on repatriation of American Indian sacred objects from foreign nations. Last is Laxman Belbase. Laxman's a gender justice and child civil rights activist with over 17 years of experience. His experience includes advocacy, monitoring, and evaluation, activism, and organizational development in the field of gender equality, children's rights, and social justice at the national and global levels. In addition, he also teaches an undergraduate course here at the Elliott School on masculinities in international affairs, and he is a member of the Leadership Council of the Global Women's Institute at the George Washington University. So I'd like to start the conversation by recognizing Dr. Graham, who I've had the pleasure to work with over the last several years. And I wanted to ask her, why does gender matter in our analysis of international affairs policymaking?
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. So thank you for that question. I am going to just briefly make some remarks, responding obviously specifically to that question, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A later. So gender matters to international affairs and policymaking because we live in a deeply unequal world. So as we all know, gender is very much at the center of how our societies are constructed. And gender is really looking at the social relationships between women and men and all genders in any given society. So we're not talking about biology. Gender really is a power. It's all about power. So when we're thinking about gender, we're thinking about gender relations, we're thinking about gender roles, gender responsibilities. And then we're also thinking about how we've come to learn about ways of behaving as women and men in any particular culture or society. So, for example, no country in the world today is there full gender equality. And for anybody who may think we're living in a post-feminist world, I can reassure you, we most definitely are not. So how do these gender roles and relations become formed? They are really created within the family unit, within schools, within religious institutions, through the media, etc. And so these become normalized and naturalized, so much so we don't even see them very often or question them or challenge them. We just come to think of gender as normal or natural. And in the very famous words of IR feminist theorist Cynthia Enloe, whenever feminists are thinking about gender and international affairs, our antennae become alerted when we hear the words natural or normal. We're always considering what are the environmental conditions that are creating particular relations in a given society. What are the power hierarchies and asymmetries, and who has power? And how do we identify who has power and privilege and who doesn't? And we can identify that quite easily by looking at who has access to resources, who has access to leadership positions, who is dominating the decision-making roles within national institutions. So these are some of the key questions we ask as gender experts, as gender advisors, and as feminist educators. So patriarchal beliefs, ideas really lead to creation of these hierarchies that generally valorize men, masculinities, and maleness. And they tend to de-emphasize or devalue or minimize the roles linked to the feminine. So for example, childcare, most of childcare work is unpaid, for example. So these are certain ways that we can ascertain, who has power, who has access to resources, and what is deemed to be important in a given society. So we know that most security institutions are led by men, and that militaries, for example, are male dominated, and very often security processes are also male dominated as well. So if we think more about intersections of power, we're talking about race, we're talking about religion, we're talking about class, age, ethnicity, disability, ability, nationality, sexuality. So these intersections of identity create more power or privilege or discrimination and marginalization of a particular group in society. And we know that across the globe, women and sexual and gender minorities in the main have less power and less access to resources and rights. For example, in 72 countries, same-sex relationships are criminalized. And in 10 of those countries, the penalty can be the punishment of death. 1 out of 3 women globally will be subjected to sexual or physical violence in her lifetime. And in many instances, that will be in the domestic setting, intimate partner violence. 130 million girls will not access education, and the world's largest group of people who are illiterate are women. Economically, there is a 20% gender pay gap, is the average across the globe, and also in 115 of 131 countries, women face economic and legal barriers to setting up their own businesses. So these are just some of the examples, some of the statistics and data that helps us to see, who has access to resource and power in different contexts across the globe. Another interesting statistic is that the World Economic Forum predicts it'll take another 257 years before women have economic equality with men. If we look at the political system, we have an overrepresentation of men as parliamentarians, 75% of our parliamentarians, with women only making up 25% across the globe. In recent studies conducted with women parliamentarians, 82% said they experienced some form of sexist attacks, misogyny, harassment, death threats, either online or offline. So when we come to security in particular, and when we think about military and militarized institutions, only 5% of all UN military peacekeepers are women, and 10% of our military police are women. Now, this is really important because women in many conflict, post-conflict contexts cannot communicate directly with men from outside their immediate family or ethnic group, and because of religious and cultural norms. And so if we don't have women peacekeepers present on missions, 50% of the population in that context will not be able to communicate their security concerns to the mission. Women peacekeepers are obviously very important in terms of intelligence gathering, as I've just mentioned, but also very important in terms of being able to search women at checkpoints, at borders, on patrols, and are key in our actions to counter violent extremism. Because often women are smuggling, are in positions where they may be smuggling weapons or monies across borders. So it's important that we have women who are part of peacekeeping missions as well. When we think about peace negotiations, and if we just look at the ongoing negotiations that have been happening in Afghanistan, women are underrepresented. Only 4 women have been party to the Afghani peace talks on the Afghani government side, and none from the Taliban delegation. And this is despite the fact that over 100 leaders from across the globe have called for women's participation, for women's inclusion and representation, including 5 former US Secretaries of State. And still we have this underrepresentation. And yet again, the data tells us very clearly that when women are present in peace talks, it has a 64% increase of success and a 35% chance of lasting for up to 15 years. Now, this is crucially important because the average peace agreement only lasts for 5 years. So these are some critical examples of where women are being excluded from peace and security, and yet their presence makes a huge difference. I'm going to talk now briefly about global gender policy making and peace and security. So within this context, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and its 9 sister resolutions, which make up a suite of resolutions called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So this particular agenda is the framework that calls on national governments, this is the Security Council calling on national governments to ensure that women are included in peace and security processes. And there are 4 pillars within this particular policy-making agenda. They are the prevention of violence against women and girls, including sexual and gender-based violence. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, there are very high incidence of the use of rape as a weapon of war during conflicts historically and ongoing currently today as well. So participation of women in all decision-making processes to do with peace and security. And again, you may or may not be aware of, women are always involved in peace processes, but they're involved informally. They're involved at the grassroots. They're not giving the resources they need to conduct the work that they do at a formal or at a higher level. So this is really important, that there is formal recognition and inclusion of women in all aspects of peace and security. Obviously, the protection of women's own security, and also their economic, their political, and their social rights, that they are also protected. And then that women have access to relief and to recovery post-conflict. Now, the good news is that 86 countries have adopted national action plans responding directly to this UN Security Council resolution and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And those national action plans are, have different degrees of robustness in terms of indicators, goals, budgets, and independent monitoring and evaluation. And we can talk about that perhaps more in the Q&A. Another important step forward has been that the US government and the US is the first country in the world to pass a law, which is the Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017. So that has passed into law the national security strategy focusing on women, peace and security. And it has tasked 4 government departments, USAID, State Department, Department of Defense, and Department of Homeland Security to create implementation plans that speak directly to lines of effort and objectives that have been set out within the US national strategy. So I'm going to kind of bring everything full circle now and just kind of finish my remarks by saying that if we don't include a gender lens, if we don't have a gender analysis or a gender perspective of international affairs, our research, our data, our understandings, and our policies are partial. They are not holistic, and they are leaving out large swathes of the population, and those communities and groups are usually women, girls, sexual and gender minorities. So by bringing in a gender lens, we create a more holistic picture of any particular context within international affairs work. So just to finish, I think this is a really important point to note, that we know that countries where women are more equal, that those countries are more stable, secure, and prosperous. And so these are, again, important criteria and important reasons why we should be ensuring that our policy making is very much driving gender equality in all of our international affairs efforts and our foreign policies. And I know we're going to hear from our panelists on some more detail around some of those ideas. So thank you. And I will now pass back to Marcus. Thank you.
Shirley, thank you so much for laying the foundation for the discussion moving forward. I do hope we get an opportunity, especially for our new students, to talk a little bit about how ways in which gender and awareness of gender has been integrated into the international affairs curriculum, but we'll hold that for the discussion, and Al, thank you very much. I'd like to move to Dr. Harrison because she's worked on issues of race, and I was wondering if you could provide some critical reflections on the intersections of race and gender, and then how this has fit into your research agenda over the years.
Thank you, Marcus. It is a pleasure to be here today. And thank you to the Diversity and Inclusion Council for organizing this and being intersectional with the groups within GW who were part of the process of organizing this. So as we look at this issue of intersectionality, how did I come to including issues of race and gender within my work and my research? Well, the answer is very simple. I started with me. And so I would challenge the students here, particularly students of color, to look within yourself and figure out where do you sit within intersections of life, just period, because you can take that into an academic or policy or career endeavor. So for example, how I started my research is I was in school, earning a master's of religious studies at Howard University, and I had to do a master's thesis. So I thought, well, what am I gonna do a thesis on? And I thought, okay, well, who are you? And I'm a Black American woman who's a lawyer in a school studying religion. So I thought, well, what topics do all of those things converge on? And there are a number of them, but one of them in particular was reproductive rights, and in the US in particular, the idea of reproductive justice, because Black women have experienced those issues within a very unique context in the United States that happened to bring together law, policy, religion, Blackness, and femaleness all into a single topic. And so that's how I got started down that road. I don't have a medical background at all. I don't have a scientific background at all. And I was working in energy. But within my studies, I started by looking at the intersections of my own life and how I could move those issues into the forefront through research, scholarship, and academic study. So for the new students in particular, who are just beginning to try to figure out what you're going to write on, what your focus is going to be, for the purpose of this conversation, for our students of color, start by looking at yourself and see where you intersect within society and how you can turn that into an area of study. And I would also challenge our white students to do the same. Take whatever topic you're looking at and then try to find information and data and sources that present another perspective beyond where you intersect. So I would challenge you to include, if you're doing research and the vast majority of the sources you're finding are predominantly white, expand your search. Start looking at sources that go beyond the things that look like you. And if you're having difficulty doing that, that's a perfect opportunity to speak with professors and ask them and say, listen, I'm coming up against this wall when it comes to sources and resources for my research. I want to expand and be intersectional. Have conversations with your professors about how you can be intersectional. And if your professors aren't of any help, guess what? That's what the library is for. Librarians are a wonderful resource that are underutilized. Their whole job is to help you with your research and expand your knowledge base to find sources that are difficult or challenging for you as a student, as a researcher, as a professional, or a professor. That's what they're there for. So utilize the resources at your disposal in order to help you be intersectional in your work and in your study. Now, when it comes to these issues of race, after I finished my master's degree, when I decided I wanted to pursue a PhD, I decided to continue the same topic, but look at the continent of Africa. And when it comes down to it, and just, kind of following up on some of what Shirley said, when it comes to my own research, I looked at the continent of Africa when it came to law and policy and reproductive rights and how religion influenced law and policy. And I did a continental overview of Africa, but then I did a case study in South Africa in particular. And one of the things that came out of my research is that fundamentally within South Africa, there is an issue within the health sector when it comes to parity and equality of access to healthcare in the public healthcare system for women of color exercising their reproductive rights. But what I discovered is that a lot of those issues also stem from systemic issues within the medical system. So if South Africa can solve the problem for this intersection of poor African women in the health sector seeking reproductive rights, they will also simultaneously solve problems for men, people of higher economic status, and non-Black women, including Indian and white women in South Africa who access the public healthcare system. So one of the things that I think is important, and the reason why intersectionality is critical, particularly for women of color in various societies, is that we often are the marginalized of the marginalized. And if you are a woman of color and you're LGBTQ, then you are the marginalized of the marginalized of the marginalized. Right? And so within that context, it means we often experience the greatest challenges when it comes to exercising our equal rights, our equal access, and our equal ability to I guess, engage in the full citizenship that we're supposed to have access to within any given country, including here in the US. So if you can solve the problems for those marginalized groups, they end up benefiting the entire whole of the society at a much greater level. Everyone benefits, but yet there seems to be this stereotype or this misnomer that if you focus special attention on marginalized groups, then you're excluding everyone else and they're getting special treatment. When no, they're getting treatment and focus on their issues in order to bring parity to the discrimination or marginalization that they're experiencing. And in the process of addressing those systemic or systematic ways in which they're discriminated, the society as a whole benefits, including non-marginalized or less marginalized groups. And so that is the benefit of intersectional study, because then it can take you into intersectional work. It can take you into intersectional policy development, which can expand the realm of which our leaders see things. Because then when you come and you have a seat at the table, if you're fortunate enough within international affairs, you bring that intersectional background and study with you. And so you see everything through that lens and you speak in that way, and you can expand the thought processes and analysis of other leaders at the table with you who may not have your experience or who may not have ever bothered to study or work in an intersectional way. And so I would also say, don't be afraid to do that. And so one of the most important things that I do, and it's been a process throughout my life, and that is bringing my whole self to everything I do, because I am literally a living intersection. And so I don't compartmentalize myself. I bring my whole self into the room, to the table, to conversation, to leadership, to policy analysis, to engagement, because that is the only way that people can begin to understand and experience intersections by experiencing me. And the way in which I bring intersectionality into the room. And so I would hope that coming out of this, those students who are listening and at the beginnings of your educational careers, either undergrad or grad, that this kind of help expand your thinking about what types of research or engagement or classes that you will choose to pursue while you're here at GW.
Thank you so much for your words. I especially appreciate the practical recommendations that you've given to our new students as they come to navigate the curriculum and develop their own perspectives on intersectionality. And so many of the students at the Elliott School are interested in pursuing their careers in the State Department or in the Foreign Service. And so I wanted to turn to Ambassador Bushnell to ask her what examples she can draw from her career that would highlight and foreground and promote the importance of gender and race in diplomatic relations. And I think you're muted.
Thank you. I have been fascinated by what Dr. Graham and what Dr. Harrison have said. So to what Dr. Harrison has said, absolutely, authenticity. If you want to be an ambassador, if you want to be a diplomat, you create your own persona, right? How do you want other people to perceive you? And that needs to be authentic. To Dr. Graham's comments, if you consider that every problem is a leadership opportunity, oh my goodness, people, do you have leadership opportunities or what? Now, Way long time ago, I used to be an expert in adult development. So let me tell you that the developmental purpose of the 20s is to experiment. Experiment socially, experiment professionally. We have different social relationships, we have different professional relationships, and most of us in the United States settle down at about 32. So by all means, experiment. You don't have to make a decision for the rest of your life. I joined the Foreign Service when I was 35 at the mid-level under an affirmative action program with a background in the Foreign Service because I was raised as a privileged white American in post-World War II Germany and France and Cold War Pakistan and Iran. Most of the people who came into the affirmative action program at mid-level with me, women and Black people, failed because nothing was done to help us compete with people who had been in the service for 6 to 8 years. So, and let me tell you, mid-80s, I am sitting with an older Foreign Service officer, and he goes into saying, Foreign Service has never been the same since. They've allowed, and I was waiting for minorities and women. He said, never been the same since they allowed people from land grant colleges to come in. Okie dokie. As a graduate of the University of Maryland, I had to take him on. All right. So the Foreign Service is not, nor the Department of State is not friendly to women, Black people, people with disabilities and so forth. I say that because umpteen reports have said so. There is a concerted effort. There is a recognition that the State Department is a misogynist and racist systemically institution, and there are efforts to change that, including the possibility of a new Foreign Service Act. You, my friends, who are going into studying, have a chance to look at what kind of foreign service do you want, and get your voices heard, because the discussion is not only not over, it's only just beginning. Number two, I learned that as a woman, people didn't like me. So I had to confront the fact that people didn't like me and to use whatever opportunities I could as a female. This is the first time. My second posting was in then called Bombay, now Mumbai, India. I was in charge of management and post security, but the consul general had broken his arm the day after Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had been assassinated. And he said, we need to get to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the section of it in Bombay, sign the condolence book, and your job is to sign before the Russian consul general gets there. And I thought, really? So this is what diplomacy is all about, getting your friggin' signature? At any rate, fine. The only woman I am, and an Indian official, also the only woman on her side, sees me and puts me in the middle of the queue next to the Russian consul general. Together we go toward a desk that has the condolence book, behind which is a television camera. He starts trying to push me aside. Okay, this is when I recognize that the Cold War can get really personal. He's trying to push me aside and I'm leaning into him. So we go, leaning into one another, side by side up, and he has a choice to make. He can push this little white woman aside, or he can be a gentleman and say, after you. After you, he said, I had no issue taking advantage of being a woman to get my signature. Not that it stopped the Cold War, but do you want to have help? Ask for it. And for those of us of a certain age, it is our obligation to, I think, reach out our hand and mentor and provide that kind of help, because that's one of the reasons we who came in under affirmative action a lot of us didn't make it. We did not have help. How did gender work to my disadvantage? I am ashamed to say that the greatest disadvantage was within the Department of State and my own colleagues. As ambassador to the Republic of Kenya and chief of mission with a personal responsibility given to me by a machine-signed letter from the President of the United States, I was, as all ambassadors are, personally responsible for the safety of every American in country. I had a vulnerable embassy that did not meet State Department security standards. I started going back and saying this does not meet standards. 8 months before Al-Qaeda blew us up with a truck bomb that came right next to the embassy, I was told to stop nagging, and I want to know which 4-star general has ever been told to stop nagging around issues of force protection. After I was blown up, when I read to my horror in the New York Times that Prudence Bushnell was seen to be obsessed with security and wrote a highly emotional letter to the Secretary of State. Well, yes, I did. I wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, but this female ambassador knows jolly well you are not emotional. No one had read that letter, but because I was female, I was obsessed before, kept nagging, and then after I was obsessed and writing emotional letters. Now, so that's the disadvantage. Overseas, I had not only did I get rank, and by the way, age helps, so don't worry about getting older. Believe me, as women, elder babes have a whole lot to contribute. So, age, competence, having developed my persona as someone who is not going to be bullied. I would not take your power, but you're not taking mine either. I end up in Nairobi, Kenya. The President Moi refuses to see me because he's so upset that they send a woman. I finally do get in to see him, and we established a kind of relationship which no man could ever establish. As in, he loved to yell at people. Tall man peered down and started yelling. And at one point I said, "Why are you yelling at me? I just came to say jumbo, hello." Another time, we are in a policy discussion and he's ranting, and I interrupt and say, "Mr. President, you know, we're arguing again." "Yes, I know we got." I said, "Well, how is it for you?" "I like it. I'm a Democrat," he says. I also got a lot of policy things out of him. With the president of Guatemala, he actually said, when a National Geographic program came to do ambassadors overseas, and they were there for 4th of July event, he actually said to the cameras, "This ambassador pulls my ears a lot, but I probably need it." What I did say to that president was, later on, "Mr. President, everybody knows that your personal secretary is a bagman." I had to ask what bagman was in Spanish. So the president of the country gets up and says, "So you say, you are telling me you think I'm stealing?" What else can I say, Senor Presidente? I dare a man to say that. Every time I sat down with warlords, they were put off their beat because they couldn't stand a short, white female looking straight in their eyes and saying, "Knock it off." I told Charles Taylor, a particularly infamous warlord, to do not call me my dear. You may call me Madam Secretary or Miss Bushnell. I call you Mr. President. I could do that. I was female, I was white, and let me tell you, I wore my white privilege throughout Africa. People were more respectful of me, and I saw how my Black colleagues were treated, not just to get a head start and show their American passport. Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is going to be our UN ambassador, hopefully, shortly, was in Rwanda when the genocide began, and the one Rwandan militia took her for a Tutsi. That is real. In Kenya, after we were blown up and Good Samaritans were taking people to hospitals, all of the white people were taken to the best hospital. Our African-American colleagues were taken to suburban hospitals and had to ask. If you are a person of color, you are going to have it more difficult. On the other hand, and I will end with this, the reason I want you to represent the United States to the world is because I believe the United States is the world. We represent people from all over the world, and if we don't make it, the world isn't going to do it. We need to be there because the problems of gender and race and sexuality that exists around the world exists in our country as well. And as we deal with it positively, so will others. And you all who are starting your careers, go for it, create change, and bring peace and equality. So when you are talking to people coming into college 50 years from now, you could relate your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bushnell. Your words are very sobering, but I really thank you for providing the motivation and enthusiasm for our young people to enter into careers in foreign service and really make a change. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, because you've been, you've spearheaded, you've been at the center of so many initiatives and so many organizations in this space. And I just wanted to ask you, related to the latest initiative, the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, what are some of your activities and initiatives you've developed, especially those that relate to students? And I think you're muted as well.
Great. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate being here, and looking forward to starting class next week, actually, starting another semester. So yes, thanks. And yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of your organization and what we're doing. I've really enjoyed everything that I've heard in this with the panelists and everything. So it's been great. And I think it just really, everything that I've heard really lays the groundwork for why, I started the organization that I started in 2017. And mainly to highlight some of the things that have been mentioned already, which is that, the lack of diversity really in the policy spaces in terms of, all types of diversity, but particularly racial diversity, which is what I focus on a lot, because in the area that I'm in, which is arms control, non-proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, there's really a dearth of diversity in that field. And when I first entered in 1990, there were very few women and even fewer people of color. Now there's more women, I'm happy to say. It's not gender parity yet, but we have certainly more women in those fields. But in terms of other types of diversity, it's still very, very problematic. And what I saw is other areas of peace and security at large, if you want to talk about climate change or infectious disease or other environmental effects like food and water security, you also see not very many people of color, and if you do in some areas, you don't see a lot of people of color at the decision-making levels, the policy-making levels. And these are issues, and you've heard, these are issues that really affect people of color, predominantly marginalized group, predominantly when you have a lack of peace and security. And yet the problem, as you know, and as you heard, is that you don't have the diversity in the decision-making roles and the policy-making roles that affect the people who are most affected. And so it was an issue that I've seen for a long time. And so when I left government in 2017, one of the first things I did was to establish an organization targeted just on that issue, which is, increasing the diverse voices in policy, increasing the number of women of color in policy, because women of color are so harmed by the lack of peace and security, to look at these as broad issues and to see how we bring in more people. It's not just ensuring that we have the people at the foreign policy tables, talking about international relations issues, looking at these peace and security issues. You have to make sure there's a pipeline. You have to make sure there's a continuous influx of young people in these fields, and you have to make sure that the pipeline isn't leaking, because even if you get young people into these fields, in marginalized groups, people of color into these fields, there's other challenges that are always out there, that if there's no support system, if there's no network, if there's no focus on the issues of inclusion, making people feel as if they belong, dealing with unique challenges that people of color have, the pipeline will leak and you'll still lose people, and you still won't have people in these important positions of decision making. So I recognize the importance of the entire pipeline, because I myself did not really get into this field until after I graduated with my law degree. It's when I really got into these fields, and that really was by chance. I just happened to be at a meeting where they were talking about weapons of mass destruction, and I just fell for that. And I said, "This is great. This is what I want to do," but that didn't have to happen. And so finding ways to increase the interest of young people and then keep people in their careers as they go through. And I hope that many of you young folks who really are interested in these fields, and I hope you are, and that you will stay interested in it, and that there will be support systems. So one of the things that is so important for my organization that we do is providing access and bringing people in. So looking at those things that I mentioned, about, having people there, having a network, letting people know that we exist. I mean, another thing that you will often hear, particularly as you go further in your career, is that we don't know anyone who does these things that's a person of color. And that's just not true. These people do exist. We do exist. And so that's something else I wanted to look at with the organization, and also to make sure that we give young people a platform. Very often in DC, we publish the same people, and publishing is very important, but it's always the same people, particularly, and here I'm talking more in the policy spaces. And so young people don't have a voice. They don't feel like they have a voice. And it's very difficult to figure out how do you break that, how do you crack the system so that you can also be heard. So there's a number of things that my organization does. And if you want to just check it out, because I certainly am not going to go through everything because I don't have time. We're at WCAPS.org, WCAPS.org, and you can see. But we have, we set up a few things. One, we have a Young Ambassadors program, which is something that it's run by young ambassadors, and these are usually people who are either upper college or grad school, young adults, and they do their own programs. They have their own events with the organization. We just started something called a GINSER program, which is for young people who are in junior high school, and college, and they're developing programs for them. And we also, of course, have the regular WCAPS. We also have a mentorship program. We have over 400 people in our mentorship program. So that's something else that you can think about, because so much of it, as I said, is about providing that support system that is needed to make it in these fields. And, it's great to get in and have all the smarts and have all the connections. But, there are challenges that are unique to people of color, unique to marginalized groups. And, you need that network. Times like, what's happened 2 days ago. You need that network, you need that support group, and that's very, very important to us. So we do have that mentorship program, and we have a number of things that we do. In addition to that, we have a great podcast program. And the reason why we do the podcast is so that you may want to get into a particular area of work and you may not know a person of color who's in that field, and you want to hear what were their challenges. So we have over 60 podcasts, majority of women of color who are in the field, and anyone can listen to it, because WCAPS it's open to anyone can join, and it's free, by the way. So, but you can look through the podcast and say, I just want to hear about other experiences. We also have a pipeline of experience, which if you go to that webpage, you see a long list of substantive areas of work. And if you click on it, it'll open up a long list of women of color and other members who are in those fields. And then you can actually get a sense of who's working in, illicit trafficking or international development or diplomacy, or climate change or global health. I mean, they're all there. And it's amazing because if you want to you just want to get some role models. I just want to see who's out there doing this stuff. So it's really great. We have done publications. Recently, we did a first-time publishers publication, and what that is the young ambassadors had their own publication because they wanted to get the word out, as I said. So they had their own publication, and WCAPS has done a number of our own publications. We just did one on the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and it has all of the different issues because we have 13 working groups, and these working groups do all types of issues, whether like the categories I already said, climate change, illicit trafficking, weapons of mass destruction, human rights, peacekeeping. There's quite a few. And each one of the working groups did a 3-pager, 2 to 3 pager on what they think the next administration should do. So this is all on the website, you can see. And I guess the other thing I'll mention is we have 6 chapters. We're just opening up a chapter in Atlanta next month. But we have a chapter in New York, a chapter in California, a chapter in the United Kingdom, a chapter in France, and a chapter in Ghana. So we're expanding, and we're going to be figuring out how we can do mentorships with our different chapters. So you could have you could have a mentor in France, you could have a mentor in Ghana, you could have a mentor, in London or just outside where you are right now. So these are all things that are available for all of you, because we understand the importance of bringing in young people, interesting them into these different issues, and understanding that finally that all of these issues have impact on us and on you. And so, understanding climate change, and you don't have to be an expert, but understanding the importance of these different peace and security issues that impact marginalized communities so predominantly, you have to know what's going on. And one last thing, I keep saying one last thing is I was watching on YouTube, and I guess some of you may have seen the dancing robots that this Boston company has, and they're dancing to I think a 50s song. And I was so amazed by that. And I got the same feeling I had when I walked into the room. They were talking about weapons of mass destruction. I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. I think that if I was a young person and I had seen that video, I would have definitely said, I'm getting into AI. I am getting into robots. It was so cool. They were dancing. Do you love me? It's a great YouTube video. You gotta see it. And so I posted on Twitter. I was like, okay, young folks, get into this. You got to get into this now because this is the future. So these are all things that matter to all of us. So definitely have a wide lens when you specialize in something, but understand how these issues affect all of you. So I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One thing I hope we get a chance to discuss a little bit more in the Q&A is the recommendations that you do have for the first 100 days of the Biden administration, because I know you're involved in the transition at the State Department. So thank you so much. And also, it's an important time to also consider the role of men in this. And so what I'd like to do is turn to Laxman and ask him if he could provide some examples of how his organization, MenEngage, is working with men in this community and what some of the achievements have been of this organization as well.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting to join this panel. So I think, where I will start is, bringing men into the conversation on gender. And I think what we always see when it comes to gender, men feel that that's not our area of work, or that has nothing to do with who I am, what I do, the way I behave, and who I am as an identity, as an institution. And always, when it comes to the gender as an area of subject, men generally tend to ignore that area of work. Whereas the same men sit in the decision-making positions across the institutions, across the states, across the globe. And then, that revolves into the role they don't see themselves playing in this international policy making spaces, as well as individuals at at an individual level, but also at the institutional and other levels that they are part of. My engagement with this work actually comes from the other side of the equation, meaning I'm originally from Nepal, so my experience on working with gender and issues, and especially on engaging boys and men in this work, comes from the how the policy implications impact the lives of people who are in the so-called developing world, and what that relates and what that means for the people living in those parts of the world to be having implications of the policies that are made by the global north countries and the Eurocentric policies that are developed and then being implemented in countries that are so-called developing and receiving part of the world. And that brings to the point of how the power and privilege of individuals, institutions, and nation and state building processes impact on the policies when it comes to equality, justice, peace, security, and so on. And that's what we engage in the course, is to look at the notions, what we call about masculinities, or the notions of why, or delve into why men behave in the way they behave. We heard some stories from how men has been becoming dominant. In the chat box I see the men will come in to push women back even and take on the privilege, the role. And why do men behave that way? Why? What are men born violent or that way when they are child, or what happens to their life so that they behave in the particular way? And what is it that we need to understand to bring more men into it? And are all majority of men violent? Which if you look at the use of violence, the violence is perpetrated by a minimal number of men, but then the larger group of men become complicit to the system that we are part of, thereby becoming part of the problem. So what we are trying to look into this is how these relationships between and among men work in order to push them into the same equation, so that they don't feel connected when it comes to gender equality and issues as if they are not gendered beings. So what we try to unpack is how men are socialized as gendered beings, and what is its implication to people around them, especially women and people of diverse gender identities and others who are at the margins of the margin. So we try to look into that, and then the experiences that we have in MenEngage actually MenEngage is a global network, and we are present in over 74 countries right now, where we are daily in a constant, daily basis dealing with the issues of changing individual men's behavior, but also working with men in power positions, and how can we bring men in power positions to work and support the effort on gender equality, and then also to look at policy normative frameworks that looks into challenging this hegemony of patriarchal power and the privileges that men bring into in all the spaces. And then the last point, and I'll wait for more conversation rather, and is to look at how this, the theories around men's life work, so that the way that compels men to behave or be complicit to things happening around them, the injustices, the inequalities that we see all around the world, and be part of that problem rather than joining the solution. So we encourage men in all sectors to join in from an intersectional perspective, from a non-Eurocentric, non-decolonized, sort of decolonized approach when it comes to international relations, and how these notions and how these patriarchal masculine institutions or global spaces operate when it comes to issues around gender equality, justice, and human rights. And we try to bring that element into the conversation, also emerging the academic theory, but also from a practical perspective of the work that we MenEngage and our members NGOs do in different parts of the world, and how they are working from national level to regional level to international level when it comes to policy making spaces. And then when we talk about men and boys, it has become a buzzword in the international development sector these days, including international affairs and international policy making spaces, which has been resulting a bit of challenging context in that sense, because it seems to be putting men back into pedestal so that they come into limelight, whereas the work that we are trying to do is not exactly what that is, not to bring men into limelight or positions of power, but work in a more intersectional feminist approach. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I know we're coming up a little bit, toward the end of our discussion, and so I wanted to sort of panel a few of the questions that I've seen that have come in, and there are two that are very related. The first would be, how, as women of color, how do you balance the need for authenticity with career success? But also, secondly, how can you use your voices within your organizations without fear of retaliation from male superiors or other superiors? So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, maybe starting with Dr. Harrison.
Yes, thank you. I saw those questions in the chat as well. So the first thing I'll say is just a reality check. And there is no such thing as doing something without fear of retaliation. That's just reality. There's the possibility and high likelihood that there will be some sort of retaliation. And that's the nature of why there are certain protected classes under the law when it comes to discrimination. So that is unfortunately still a fact of life in the professional world, in the academic world, in school. It doesn't matter. If you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're both, if you are LGBTQ, those are realities. So what comes with that is learning how to navigate it and learning how to work within it as you also work to dismantle it, right? And so for me, in my experience, one of the things I would say is, like, for example, I'm sitting here in African clothes, right? I've always worn African clothes to work. They've become more plentiful now, but I mean, in a very predominantly white, male, conservative, energy environment, as an attorney, I wore African clothes to work whenever I had them. I also wore suits and regular, but I've mixed it because that is exactly who I am. But the way I managed to navigate through the discrimination that I still faced, including with some superiors, is I was excellent at my work. And I always was inclusive with my work. And this is one of those things where they say you've got to be 10 times better. You have to be exceptional in your work, not just because it's your own personal work ethic, which it happens to be mine, but because it is the only way to fight against the discrimination. Particularly, someone asked through the evaluation process, bring your receipts to your evaluation, where you can demonstrate the value you have brought to the organization. You can demonstrate the success of the endeavors you've been involved in. You can demonstrate the work that you have done throughout. And another way that you can do that with bringing your receipts to your evaluation is build relationships with other people outside of your chain of command within the organization, and build relationships with people in positions of influence who might be able to influence your supervisor. Right? So as you build relationships with them and you demonstrate good work and quality work to them and work with them, then you can bring those things to the table. For example, a long time ago in my work at a trade association, I became the first and the youngest person to lead a national policy initiative that was identified by the board of directors. Guess who put me forward? All of the other executives and VPs within the organization put my name forward. My boss pushed against it and didn't want me to have it. But how did I get it? They overrode him because they saw my work and I had built relationships with them. And so I was assigned that task because in the end, he couldn't fight back against the rest of them because there were too many of them. They outnumbered him and said, what are you talking about? She's great. We want her to do this, period. And that was the end of the conversation. And I was assigned to do the work. So bring excellence, build relationships with other people in positions of influence, and bring your receipts when it comes to times for performance evaluation, and recognize that it will continuously be a fight until we actually achieve parity, true parity and equitable treatment, which is a process of changing mindsets as well as cultures. It is a reality that we're in. And I think that's the reason why we're having panels like this, because people want to know and understand, how do I navigate this world? Well, we've been there. And so with honesty, you will be there at some point. Take these things to heart. And in the process of navigating your own challenges, focus on the lessons learned and use those lessons to help improve your own chances as you move forward, and reach back and teach other people and bring other people with you and equip those people. And lastly, I think I'll say, as a woman of color, don't be afraid to never think that all white people or all men or all white men are the enemy, because they're not. It can be challenging within a new environment to figure out who's safe and who's not. That comes with the territory. But I can say within my career, the people who have done the most to advance me and who have been my allies and mentors to help advance my career have been white men. Older white men who are now in their 70s and things like that. They have been the ones who have had my back. When other people have engaged in discrimination, I could go to them and they stood up for me. They're the ones who advanced me, created opportunities for me. Why? Because they saw the excellence of my work. And they saw the excellence of my character and knew that I was capable and were willing to stand up for me. So it's also a process of learning and discovering who your allies are. But that comes with what I said before about building relationships with other people in the organization, so you can learn who you can trust and who you cannot.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. That was so powerful. And you know, just to put myself into that, I wish I had had some of the guidance that you were able to provide, you know, earlier in my career myself. And so that's just amazing. And I'm so glad that this is being recorded for future use by our students and those who are not here today and who weren't here to experience this great panel. I think we have a couple more minutes, and I wanted to see if any other members of the panel would like to contribute on that question, and then I think we'll have to wrap.
I'll come in, Marcus.
Thank you.
I just want to add, generally from a woman perspective, feel it, you know, around this question of authenticity and not having your voice heard. I think another strategy that's very important is to create alliances within your institution or organization, you know, amongst your peer group, you know, people who will support you, who really value what you're contributing and what you're, you know, adding to your organization, and who will back you up. Simple things like being in a meeting, and when you make a contribution, somebody else says, I just heard what Shirley said. And, you know, whether you agree with me or not, just the fact that you're being acknowledged in that meeting, that, you know, you're being heard and you were being valued. And just one final thing I'd like to say before we wrap up on this point, we have just recently created this new student consortium across 18 universities in DC on women, peace and security. We've created it here out of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs. I'm going to put the link in the chat box. This is just a little plug now for this consortium, because I think many of you will be interested in joining it. We're really focused on deepening the agenda on women, peace and security, bringing in what Laxman was talking about, men, masculinities, new understandings around broadening out gender relations and gender equality, ensuring that LGBTQI people are included in the work, the analysis and the policy making, and also connecting with coalitions of students and experts and policymakers in the DC area, but also with other educational institutions and other programs and departments outside of international affairs, like the humanities, like the arts, for example. So it's a really exciting initiative, and I would just really encourage any of you who are interested in this to join it. So that's my final remark. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting opportunities for our students to get involved. And I'd like to turn it over to Kylie, who has some remarks to recognize our sponsors for today.
Thank you so much. I just want to say again, thank you to Dr. King for moderating such an excellent discussion, and to all of our incredible panelists. I know that each of you, I could have sat and listened to for a couple of hours on an individual program. And so, but it was really meaningful to hear how all of it really came together. And, you know, we're so lucky to be able to do this, especially welcoming in new students to our community and starting to have these conversations at the beginning of their time in the Elliott School. So I just thank you so much. We also really want to recognize and appreciate our partners in this. I think Peter mentioned at the beginning, you know, the International Affairs Society came up with this event idea last semester to look at some of these themes, and they were so generous in having us, you know, incorporate that into the new student experience. We love working with student organizations, and having the Young Black Professionals in International Affairs partner with us, you know, just continues to make connections for the students at the peer level, much to what Dr. Graham was just speaking to. And then of course, partnering with GIA and with LEAP, exceptional initiatives within the Elliott School. I'm going to drop the websites into the chat so you all can explore the extraordinary work of those programs. And we're so grateful to always have that partnership. I think it takes such a community to develop inclusive and thoughtful spaces, and to have the resources to be able to equip our students, you know, in their time at the Elliott School and then in their careers. So we're very excited. Welcome to all of our new students. Thank you to everyone else who joined in this meaningful discussion. And our Office of Diversity and Inclusion within the Elliott School will continue to host programs that touch on very similar themes. There are many ways to get involved if you're a new student who wants to contribute to events like this or other initiatives that we have. So I'll share our website as well. But thank you so much to everyone for coming today. And again, to our incredible panelists. And I hope you all take good care and rest as best as possible. And certainly good luck on the first week of classes, which is just around the corner. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.